Hey everyone, and welcome back to my channel. So in today's video I'm going through all the books that I read in January. In total I read 11 books in January, so 9 of those were physical books or ebooks, and then 2 of those were audiobooks. Most of the books that I read came out as 4 or 5 stars, so pretty good start to the year reading wise. Everything else wasn't so great, but we're not going to talk about that. I've mentioned this in a few videos already, but this year I'm using something called Corepile to rate and review all of the fiction books that I read. For anyone who doesn't know, Corepile is a rating system that was created by G at Book Roast. I'll leave the details linked down below if you wanted to find out more, but it basically means that when I rate a book, it gets a score out of 10, and then that score corresponds to a rating out of 5, so a star rating. I'll put a table on the screen here so you can hopefully see what I'm talking about, but as always I will have timestamps linked down below, so if you did want to skip ahead at any point, if there are any particular books that you're interested in, then you can. So the first book that I read in January was The Girl in the Tower by Katherine Arden, and this is the second book in the Winternight Trilogy, which is a historical fantasy series that's set in Russia. It follows a girl called Vasia who has this ability to see these creatures, these spirits, that most people have only heard about through myths and folklore. And the book does actually feel a lot like you're reading a fairy tale because of the writing style. It's very beautiful and it feels very whimsical. What I really liked about this second book was that the world expands quite a lot and the setting changes and it's a lot more political, I guess. The only thing I kind of struggled with was the pacing, because especially at the beginning of this book, it's very, very slow paced and not a lot happens for probably the first half. And so I did struggle with that a little bit. If you like fantasy books that have a historical setting, then I would recommend this series, especially if you like Laini Taylor's writing or Maggie Stiefvater's writing. Megan from Meg with Books is running a read along for this series at the moment, which is why I'm reading it. And I'll leave the details linked down below if you did want to find out more. But yeah, really looking forward to seeing how this series ends. The next 3 books that I read were for a reading vlog, which I'll leave linked down below if you haven't seen it. But basically I spent a week reading dark academia, and the first book that I read for that vlog was Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. So this is an adult fantasy book about a character called Alex Stern, who is recruited by Yale University to monitor these secret societies. So at Yale there are these 8 houses that use magic, and Alex is part of this organisation that monitors these secret societies and makes sure that they're not stepping out of line or doing anything dangerous. It's also kind of a murder mystery because at the very start of the book a young woman is found murdered and Alex is investigating to see whether one of the secret societies is responsible. I really enjoyed this book and I ended up giving it 5 stars. I can see why it wouldn't be for everyone because it is very slow in the sense that it builds up quite gradually and it's quite confusing in the beginning. You have to kind of bear with it and just have faith that it's all gonna make sense in the end. Even though it is quite slow paced, I did find that I was reading it quite quickly because of the mystery and because I wanted to find out what was gonna happen. Just a warning that it is very dark in places and there are a lot of trigger warnings for this, especially for sexual assault. And so I will leave a link to the Goodreads page in the description if you wanted to find out more. But I really love Leigh Bardugo's writing. I think there's just something about it that just kind of gels with me. And so I think this has pretty much cemented that she's one of my favourite authors, and I will buy pretty much anything that she writes now. The next book that I read for that vlog was Wilder Girls by Rory Power. So this is a young adult horror that follows a group of girls and their teachers at this boarding school on this isolated island, and they've been in quarantine for about 18 months because this virus affected them. And some of the girls died, however some of them are still alive, although this virus has caused them to have these mutations on their bodies, and all the people that are still alive are basically waiting for the people on the mainland to come up with a cure. What I liked most about this book was the setting, and the writing was very descriptive, and so I felt like I was there on this island, which was a little bit scary considering the state of the world right now. I also really liked the interactions between the characters and especially between the girls, and there's a female-female relationship that develops between 2 of the girls that I liked, but I also felt like it could have been developed more, and I feel like that pretty much summarises how I felt about this book, is that I liked the individual elements of the plot but I wanted more. However, I do also appreciate that this is a young adult book, and so I'm not the intended audience, and so I do feel like I have to take that into account. If you don't like books that are kind of ambiguous and where not everything is fully 100% explained, then you probably won't like this book. It has got quite low reviews on Goodreads, and I can kind of see why it wouldn't be for everyone, especially because there are trigger warnings for things like body horror and just general gore and violence. However, if you like weird books, then I think you might enjoy this. The next book that I read was probably the weirdest book that I have ever read, and that is Bunny by Mona Awad. So this is an adult horror that follows a character called Samantha, which is my name, and she's doing an MFA program, like a creative writing program at college. And in this class is this group of women who call themselves the Bunnies, and Samantha absolutely hates them. She can't stand them. However, somehow she ends up getting invited into their world, and weird stuff starts to happen, and that's pretty much all I can say without spoilers. I've seen this described as Mean Girls meets Alice in Wonderland meets Frankenstein, which, yeah, kind of explains the general vibe of this book. As I was reading this book, there were so many parts that were really confusing, and I think even when I finished it, I didn't quite get it. However, after speaking to other people that have read this book, I feel like it gave me a bit of a different appreciation for it, because actually on reflection, it's very clever the way that it's written, and I feel like a lot of people have taken different things from it and have understood it differently to how I understood it. And so it is one of those books that makes you think, but I also completely understand why some people would just not like this book. The next book that I read was 50/50 by Steve Cavanagh. So this is the 5th book in the Eddie Flynn series, which is a courtroom thriller series that follows a character called Eddie Flynn, who is a con artist turned lawyer. And in each of the books in this series, you're basically following him as he takes on a new case. And so each book is its own individual story, so you can read them as standalones. I've read 13, which is the 4th book in this series, and now this 5th book, and you can appreciate them without having read the rest of the series. So in 50/50, Eddie Flynn takes on this case where 2 sisters have accused each other of murdering their dad, and they're both on trial for the murder, and Eddie Flynn is representing one of the sisters, and throughout the book you're trying to work out which one of them actually did it. The book is told from 3 different perspectives, so you have Eddie's perspective, and then you also have the perspective of Kate, who is a lawyer that's working on the other team that's representing the other sister, and then you also have this mysterious she, who you don't know who it is, but you know that it's the killer. This is one of those books where you kind of have to suspend disbelief a little bit, because some of the stuff that happens isn't that realistic, and it's very dramatic and it's very fast paced. And I think this was actually my highest rated book of the month, because I gave it 5 stars. I really enjoyed it, and I think if you like fast paced courtroom thrillers, then I definitely recommend this series. The next book that I read was The Starless by Erin Morgenstern, and this is a really hard book to explain, but I'm going to try. So this follows a boy called Zachary who finds this book in a library, and it's basically a book that's filled with these short stories, and one of these short stories talks about something that happened to him in his childhood that he's never told anyone about, and so he's really confused how it's ended up in this book. And throughout the book you're basically trying to work out what is going on. It's essentially a book within a book, so you have some chapters that are following Zachary, but then you also have chapters that are these seemingly random fairy tales that are somehow connected, but you're trying to work out how throughout the book. I had a lot of mixed feelings on this book because I really like Erin Morgenstern's writing. I read The Night Circus, which is by the same author, last year, and really enjoyed that. And I think she does a really good job of writing settings, and I really liked the atmosphere in this, and I felt like I was transported into the story, and so that aspect I did really enjoy. It's the kind of book where you need to have a lot of patience and also a really good memory, because there's stuff that's mentioned towards the end, like past the 50% mark, that relates to stuff earlier in the book. And because it's quite a slow-paced book, and so I was reading it quite slowly, by the time I got to certain parts and stuff was being revealed, I couldn't really remember what it was relating to, and so I kept having to flick back and forth, and I was getting really confused. It's really difficult because I could appreciate what the author was trying to do, and I did give this 3 stars in the end. I don't feel like this is average because the writing is really beautiful, and the way that it's structured is so clever. but I think it just didn't click with me, which is a shame. The next book that I read was The Rosie Project by Graeme Simsion. So this is a contemporary romance that follows a man called Don, who is a geneticist in his late 30s, and he has never been able to get past the first date with a woman, but he's decided that he is ready to find a wife. And so he comes up with this questionnaire that he intends to give to potential dates and potential partners to narrow it down, to kind of work out if someone is going to be compatible with him. But then he meets a woman called Rosie, who is completely not what he is looking for. She doesn't meet any of the criteria, but they end up striking up this friendship as he helps her with her own project to find her biological father. It's implied or suggested in the book that Don has Asperger's. However, he's never been diagnosed and it's never actually stated. And this is the first book in a series, and so I don't know whether that is something that is explained more in later books. I did enjoy this book in the end. It was very heartwarming and it was quite a quick read. I think I finished it in like 2 days. I haven't decided yet if I want to continue this series because I think this is a trilogy, and even though I did like the first book, I don't know if I cared enough about the characters to want to keep on reading. And the way that things wrapped up in the first book, I felt like it worked quite well as a standalone. So I don't know, if you've read this series, then let me know in the comments what you thought about it and whether the other books do get better, because otherwise I think I'm just gonna leave it as that. The next book that I read was The Colour Purple by Alice Walker. So this is a classic that I think was published in the 1980s, and I'm sure most people will have heard of it because it was also adapted into a film that I haven't seen yet, but I do want to. For anyone who doesn't know though, this is a story about a woman called Celie, and I really liked the writing style of this book because it's written as a series of letters. So Celie is writing these letters to God talking about her life. I think it spans over about 30 to 40 years because Celie is a teenager at the very start of the book, and she's writing to God talking about how her father is sexually abusing her and how she's forced to marry this much older man who needs a new wife to look after his kids. And the story kind of goes from there, but it's a very character-driven book because it focuses a lot on the relationships that Celie has with the different people in her life, especially her sister Nettie, who ran away from home not long after Celie was married, and also the relationship that Celie has with Shug Avery, who is her husband's mistress. I listened to the audiobook for this and it was incredible because of the way that it's written in the first person with Celie writing these letters to God. I think it worked really, really well. The only thing I will say is that this book does obviously have trigger warnings for rape and sexual assault, and that was very difficult to listen to at times, especially the first few chapters where it's quite graphic. So just something to bear in mind if you are thinking of reading this. The next book I read was another audiobook, and that is Then She Was Gone by Jewell. So this is a thriller about a woman called Laurel whose daughter Ellie went missing around 10 years ago, and Laurel is finally at this point where she's ready to start moving on with her life, and she meets a man in a coffee shop who sweeps her off her feet, and they start this relationship. But then she goes home to meet his 9-year-old daughter, who looks the spitting image of her daughter Ellie, and it brings up all these unanswered questions, and the book is basically following Laurel as she tries to work out what happened to Ellie. I'm going to be honest, I don't have a lot of strong feelings on this book. It was fine, I gave it 3 stars, and I really enjoyed the audiobook. I thought the narration was really good and it created this really creepy atmosphere that I think I would have missed if I'd read a physical copy of the book. The plot was really predictable and I'd kind of guessed what happened to Ellie pretty much within the first few chapters, but I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing because the journey to get there was still fun, and I did enjoy the narration. Like I said, it was very engaging and I found that I wanted to keep on listening just because I was being entertained. It's not a bad book, but it's not my favourite book that I've read of Jewell. So the final 2 books that I read were Days of Blood and Starlight and Dreams of Gods and Monsters by Laini Taylor, which I'm going to put these back here. For anyone who doesn't know, these are books 2 and 3 in the Daughter of Smoke and Bone trilogy, which follows a girl called Caru, who is an art student living in Prague, but she's never really known where she came from. She was raised by this creature called Brimstone, who's a chimera, and she has this double life working for him as his messenger. And in the first book, you follow her as she learns who she really is, but then the second and third book go in a slightly different direction because they focus a lot more on this otherworldly war. That's all I can really say without spoilers, but I did really enjoy this series, and I think I gave all 3 books 4 stars each, so 4 stars for the whole series. What I liked most about this series was definitely the world building. I think that Laini Taylor has the most incredible imagination, and I really liked how in this series she blended the fantasy with the real world. Even though I did really enjoy these books, the one thing I struggled with was the romance, and I don't know how to explain this, but I really liked the characters and I really liked them separately, and it wasn't like I actively didn't want them to get together. Like, I just felt like I didn't really care either way. And you know how when you're reading a story and you get the feeling like you should be rooting for 2 characters to get together? I didn't feel that. I kind of felt like indifferent either way. There was also a romance in the 3rd book that I didn't really care about either and that seemed to come out of nowhere. However, saying that, I did really like Mick and Susanna. I felt like they had a really good dynamic and they were probably my favourite characters from the whole series. Another kind of issue that I had more with the last 2 books than the 1st book was that they felt too long, especially the 3rd book, Dreams of Gods and Monsters. That's over 600 pages and I don't think it needed to be 600 pages. I think you could have told the same story within like 400 pages and it wouldn't have made much difference. There's a lot more I could say, but I don't really want to give spoilers. However, I am really looking forward to the live show for this. So I was reading this for the Do Sab Along, which is a Daughter of Smoke and Bone read along that's being hosted by Maddie from Book Browsing Blog and a few other YouTubers. So I'll leave the link down below if you wanted to find out more. But yeah, I did really enjoy this series and I would recommend it. I don't know if I loved it as much as Strange the Dreamer, which is Laini Taylor's other series. However, I think that it's still worth reading and I am really glad now that I've finished it. Okay, so I think that brings me to the end of the video. So thanks for watching if you've made it this far. If you've read any of the books that I mentioned in this wrap up, then please let me know in the comments what you thought of them, and don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you liked it and click subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you next time. Bye.